The wedding march echoed through the grand hall, a melody of promises and new beginnings. But Rodrigo Montero's heart pounded like a war drum. His bride, Julia, stood at the end of the aisle, radiant and oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. The eyes of hundreds of guests followed her every step, but Rodrigo's mind was elsewhere, on the secrets he carried and the consequences of what he was about to do. As Julia reached the altar, her smile faltered when their eyes met. Something in his expression, fear, regret, or maybe both, made her pause. Then, to her horror, Rodrigo stepped back, his voice low but loud enough to pierce the silence. "I can't do this." A collective gasp rippled through the room as Rodrigo turned and walked away, leaving Julia frozen at the altar, her world unraveling in an instant. What could drive a man to abandon the woman he loved on the most important day of their lives? And how could such betrayal be the beginning of a story neither of them could foresee? The day had begun with a symphony of perfection. Rows of white chairs lined the lush green lawn, draped in soft ribbons of ivory and gold. Guests murmured in admiration as they marveled at the grandeur of the venue, a picturesque estate overlooking the sparkling blue sea. The scent of fresh roses filled the air, mingling with the salty breeze. Everything was flawless, as it should have been for the union of one of the city's most promising power couples. Julia stood in her bridal suite, gazing at her reflection in the gilded mirror. Her gown, an exquisite piece of lace and satin, hugged her frame with a regal elegance. The diamond tiara resting atop her soft curls sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the windows. She looked every bit the radiant bride, yet her hands trembled as she adjusted her veil. Her maid of honor, Clara, noticed. "You're stunning," Clara reassured her, stepping closer with a gentle smile. "Rodrigo won't be able to take his eyes off you." Julia smiled faintly, but unease simmered beneath her calm facade. Rodrigo had always been composed, almost too composed, and his recent behavior had been uncharacteristically distant. A nagging thought whispered in her mind. What if he's not ready for this? Downstairs, Rodrigo stood in the shadows of a quiet hallway, far from the bustling preparations. He tugged at the cufflinks on his tailored suit, his jaw tight. His best man, Lucas, found him there, his expression tense. "They're ready for you," Lucas said, though his voice lacked the usual jovial tone. He studied Rodrigo's face, noting the way his friend's eyes darted nervously. "You okay?" Rodrigo exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can do this." The admission caught Lucas off guard. Rodrigo had always been a man of action, decisive and self-assured. Yet today, doubt etched lines into his usually confident features. "You're not serious," Lucas said, his voice low but firm. "Julia's upstairs, ready to walk down that aisle. You love her, don't you?" Rodrigo hesitated, and in that hesitation, the weight of his unspoken fears pressed down on him. His company was embroiled in a series of controversies, a product recall, a whistleblower leaking confidential information, and now the possibility of a scandal that could tarnish everything he had built. Marriage, he thought, was supposed to be a fresh chapter, but all he could see was chaos. "I do," Rodrigo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But love doesn't fix everything." Lucas grabbed his shoulder. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life if you walk away. Whatever's going on, face it together. That's what marriage is about." But Rodrigo's mind was already racing. The idea of dragging Julia into a storm filled him with dread. How could he promise her a future when he wasn't even certain of his own? Minutes later, Clara peeked into the hallway, her face glowing with excitement. "It's time," she said. Rodrigo straightened, but his steps were slow, deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of his doubts. The soft notes of the wedding march drifted through the air as guests turned their heads in anticipation. Julia stood at the far end of the aisle, her arm looped through her father's, her face a vision of hope and joy. Rodrigo's heart clenched. As Julia walked toward him, her smile radiating warmth, Rodrigo felt the walls closing in. The applause and murmurs of admiration faded into the background, replaced by the deafening roar of his own thoughts. By the time she reached him, he could barely meet her gaze. The officiant began to speak, his voice steady and rhythmic, but Rodrigo's mind was elsewhere. Images of boardroom battles, lawyers hurling accusations, and headlines screaming his downfall flashed before him. He felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. When the officiant asked him to declare his vows, the silence that followed was deafening. Julia's brows knit together in confusion. "Rodrigo?" she whispered, her voice laced with concern. He stepped back, his hands trembling. "I can't do this," he said, his voice cracking. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Julia froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said, his words a rush blur as he turned and began to walk away. Julia reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve, but he was already gone. Her chest heaved as she struggled to process what had just happened. Behind her, murmurs turned to whispers, then outright speculation. Tears blurred her vision as she stood alone at the altar, the weight of his absence sinking in. The perfect day she had imagined for so long had unraveled in an instant. Clara rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her. "Julia, I'm so sorry," she murmured, though the words felt hollow. Julia wiped her tears with trembling hands, her breath hitching as she looked out at the sea of stunned faces. Forcing herself to stand tall, she squared her shoulders. "This is over," she said, her voice steady but cold. She turned and walked away, her gown trailing behind her like a shadow of what could have been. As she reached the privacy of the bridal suite, she collapsed into a chair, her sobs echoing in the empty room. Far away, Rodrigo sat in his car, the engine running but his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't bring himself to drive away. The sight of Julia's devastated face haunted him, but he convinced himself he had done the right thing. It's better this way, he thought, though the ache in his chest suggested otherwise. The morning light filtered through the large windows of Julia's apartment, bathing the room in a soft golden hue. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee while the sound of cartoons played in the background. Gabriel, her 2-year-old son, was sprawled out on the living room rug, a collection of colorful blocks scattered around him. His curls bobbed as he hummed to himself, his tiny hands working diligently to build a tower. Julia watched him with a mix of exhaustion and pride. He was her everything, the reason she had managed to survive the crushing humiliation of 2 years ago. But as she took another sip, her eyes drifted to a photo tucked into the corner of the fridge. It was an old snapshot of her and Rodrigo, taken during their engagement party. She stood abruptly, as if the memory had burned her, and turned her focus back to her laptop on the kitchen counter. The screen displayed a series of emails from clients and potential business partners. Julia owned her own law firm now, a modest but growing practice that she had built from the ground up. It wasn't easy juggling motherhood and her career, but she had no choice. Gabriel depended on her. "Mommy, look," Gabriel called, his voice bright and excited. Julia turned to see him standing proudly beside his completed tower, his grin wide and infectious. "It's amazing, Gabby," she said, setting her mug down to applaud him. Gabriel giggled then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, knocked the tower down. The blocks scattered across the floor, and he burst into laughter. Julia couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with love. He was her light in the darkest times. Later that afternoon, Julia sat in her office downtown, surrounded by stacks of case files. The hustle and bustle of the city buzzed outside her window, but inside, the room was quiet save for the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard. Julia, her assistant Mariana, poked her head through the door. "Your 3 p.m. is here. Send them in," Julia replied, closing her laptop. Her client walked in, a middle-aged woman in a crisp blazer with worry etched across her face. It was a divorce case, one of many Julia had taken on recently. She listened intently as the woman detailed her situation, offering calm, measured advice. Julia had become known for her professionalism and tenacity in the courtroom. Her reputation as one of the city's best family lawyers was growing, and with it came more opportunities. But no one, not even her closest colleagues, knew how much she had sacrificed to get here. After her engagement fell apart, Julia had thrown herself into her career. At first, it was a way to distract herself from the heartbreak and humiliation. But then Gabriel came along, a surprise that had changed everything. The discovery of her pregnancy had been bittersweet. She had spent countless nights crying herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the weight of raising a child alone. But from the moment Gabriel was born, he became her anchor. His first cry had filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she needed. Now, as she sat in her office, penning notes for her client, the memory of those early days felt like a lifetime ago. When Julia finally returned home that evening, Gabriel greeted her at the door, throwing his arms around her legs. "Mommy, hey, meu amor," she said, scooping him up into a hug. She breathed in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and crayons. "Did you have fun with Tia Clara today?" Gabriel nodded enthusiastically. "We went to the park. I saw a dog." Julia laughed, setting him down. "A dog, huh? Was it big or small?" "Big, like a lion." Gabriel spread his arms wide for emphasis. As he chattered on, Julia prepared dinner, their nightly routine unfolding with a comforting familiarity. Gabriel sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a workbook while she cooked. It was in these quiet moments that Julia felt the sharp sting of Rodrigo's absence. Gabriel didn't know anything about his father. Julia had avoided the topic, unsure of how to explain it to him. But lately, he had started asking questions. "Mommy, do I have a daddy?" he had asked a few days ago, his big brown eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Julia had frozen, caught off guard. "Of course you do, Gabby," she had replied softly. "But he doesn't live with us." "Why not?" She had struggled to find the words. "It's complicated." Gabriel had nodded, accepting her vague answer for now. But Julia knew it was only a matter of time before he pressed for more. That night, after Gabriel had fallen asleep, Julia sat on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. A notification popped up, a news alert about a tech mogul returning to Brazil to face legal troubles. Her heart stopped when she saw the name, Rodrigo Monteiro. The headline detailed accusations of fraud and mismanagement within his company, followed by speculation about his return to the country. Julia stared at the screen, her pulse racing. She hadn't seen or spoken to Rodrigo since the day he left her at the altar. The pain of that moment still lingered, raw and unhealed. But now, as she read about his downfall, a mix of emotions stirred within her, anger, pity, and something else she couldn't quite place. She closed the app and set her phone down, exhaling slowly. Whatever was happening in Rodrigo's life, it wasn't her concern anymore. Still, as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was just the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. In the quiet of the night, with only the sound of Gabriel's soft breathing coming from the next room, Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The life she had built was steady, secure. But somewhere deep down, a part of her knew that Rodrigo's return would threaten to unravel it all. Rodrigo Montero stepped off the private jet, the humid air of Sao Paulo hitting him like a wall. It had been over 2 years since he had set foot in Brazil, and though the city's skyline remained the same, everything else felt different. As he descended the stairs, he adjusted his watch and smoothed the lapel of his suit, trying to mask the unease that gnawed at him. The waiting car whisked him away to his penthouse in the heart of the city. As they sped through the streets, Rodrigo's mind churned with thoughts of the battle ahead. The accusations of fraud that had brought him back were not only a threat to his company, but to his entire legacy. The media had already begun its feeding frenzy, and Rodrigo could feel the weight of the public's judgment pressing down on him. "Welcome back, Mr. Montero," his driver said as they pulled into the underground garage of his building. Rodrigo gave a curt nod, stepping out of the car and heading straight for the elevator. The penthouse was just as he had left it, cold, pristine, and impersonal. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city, but Rodrigo barely glanced at it. He loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared into the distance. The next morning, Rodrigo's legal team gathered in the sleek conference room of his office. Papers, laptops, and coffee cups cluttered the table as his attorneys outlined their strategy. "You're facing multiple charges," said Marcos, the lead attorney. "Fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence against you is circumstantial, but the prosecution will try to make it stick." Rodrigo leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "What's our best move?" Marcos hesitated. "We need someone who can handle this with precision. A top-tier litigator who knows how to navigate high-profile cases." "Someone better than you?" Rodrigo asked, arching an eyebrow. Marcos shifted uncomfortably. "I'm good, but this requires someone exceptional. There's one name that stands out." He slid a file across the table. Rodrigo picked it up, flipping it open. The name at the top stopped him cold. Julia Vasconcelos. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the page. The photo attached showed her standing in front of her office, her expression confident and composed. Rodrigo's grip on the file tightened. He hadn't seen or spoken to Julia since the day he walked away, and now she was being presented as the key to saving him. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, tossing the file onto the table. "Not at all," Marco said, his tone serious. "She's built a reputation as one of the best. If anyone can win this case, it's her." Rodrigo's jaw clenched. He couldn't deny the logic. Julia was brilliant, relentless, and exactly what he needed. But the thought of facing her after everything he had done was almost unbearable. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply, set up the meeting. When Julia received a call from Marcos, she was in the middle of reviewing a custody agreement for a client. At first, she thought it was some kind of prank. Rodrigo Monteiro asking for her help. The audacity of it sent a wave of anger coursing through her. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice clipped. "Julia, just hear us out," Marcos urged. "It's a high-profile case, and it could elevate your career even further." "I don't need his case to prove my worth," she snapped, hanging up the phone. But the call lingered in her mind. That evening, as she played with Gabriel on the living room floor, her thoughts kept drifting back to Rodrigo. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to make him feel the sting of rejection he had inflicted on her. But another part, the lawyer in her, was curious. What had happened to him? What had gone so wrong that he was desperate enough to seek her out? The next day, against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him. The conference room of Julia's firm was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and walls adorned with framed degrees and awards. Rodrigo entered, his posture straight and his face a mask of composure. Julia was already seated at the head of the table, her arms crossed. When their eyes met, the air seemed to crackle with tension. "Julia," Rodrigo began, his voice smooth but guarded. She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let's get one thing straight. This isn't personal for me. If I decide to take your case, it will be strictly professional." Rodrigo's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Understood." Julia leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You have some nerve coming to me after what you did." "I didn't have a choice," he said simply, though even he knew how hollow it sounded. "There's always a choice," she shot back, her tone icy. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Look," Rodrigo finally said, his voice softer. "I know I hurt you, more than I can ever apologize for. But this case, it's bigger than me. My company, the people who work for me, everything is at stake. I need your help." Julia's jaw tightened. Part of her wanted to refuse, to walk away and leave him to deal with his mess. But another part of her, The part that had spent years proving her strength saw an opportunity. "I have conditions," she said firmly. "Name them," Rodrigo replied, leaning forward. "First, you will follow my lead. No interference, no surprises. Second, you'll pay my fees up front. And third," she paused, her voice hardening, "this is strictly business. Whatever we had, whatever we were, it's over." Rodrigo nodded slowly, agreed. As he rose to leave, Julia couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes. It was a stark contrast to the confident man she had once loved. When the door closed behind him, she let out a shaky breath. This case was going to test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. And deep down, she knew that facing Rodrigo again wasn't just about his legal troubles. It was about confronting the pain she thought she had buried long ago. That night, as she tucked Gabriel into bed, his small hand rested against her cheek. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'm fine, Maywa Moore. Just a long day." But as she turned off the light and sat alone in the quiet of her living room, the truth weighed on her. Rodrigo's return wasn't just a chapter from her past reopening. It was a storm on the horizon, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to weather it. The sun hung low over Sao Paulo, painting the skyline in hues of amber and gold. Julia sat at her desk. The file on Rodrigo Montero spread open before her. She had spent the entire morning reviewing the details, and the picture was grim. Fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. The charges were serious enough to send him to prison if he lost. Her assistant, Mariana, knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Rodrigo Montero is here," she said, her tone cautious. Julia closed the file with a sigh, steeling herself. "Show him in." Moments later, Rodrigo entered, his presence commanding as ever. He was impeccably dressed, his dark suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame, but there was a faint tension in his shoulders. "Julia," he greeted, his voice smooth but measured. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit." Rodrigo obeyed, his gaze never leaving hers. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "I've reviewed your case," Julia began, her tone professional. "It's a mess, Rodrigo. The evidence against you is circumstantial, but it's enough to damage your reputation permanently, even if you're acquitted." "I'm aware," he replied, his voice calm but tight. "That's why I need you." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Let me be clear about something. I don't trust you, but I trust myself. I know I can win this case because I'm the best at what I do." Rodrigo inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of her words. "I wouldn't be here if I thought otherwise. But there are conditions," Julia continued, her voice firm. "First, you follow my instructions. No improvisations, no grandstanding. Second, I don't want any personal interactions outside of this office. And third," she paused, narrowing her eyes, "you'll pay my retainer up front. No negotiations." Rodrigo's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Agreed." "Good," Julia said, leaning back. "Then let's begin." Over the next hour, they dove into the details of the case. Rodrigo laid out the timeline of events, from the whistleblower's initial allegations to the company's internal audit. Julia listened intently, asking pointed questions and taking meticulous notes. "There's something off about this," she said finally, tapping her pen against the desk. "The accusations are too specific for someone outside the company. It's likely an inside job, someone with access to your financial records." Rodrigo nodded. "I suspected as much. My former CFO, Vargas, left under suspicious circumstances right before this blew up." Julia's pen stilled. "We'll need to dig into Vargas's departure. If he's the one behind this, we can dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece." Rodrigo watched her work, his expression unreadable. Seeing her like this, focused, determined, entirely in her element, stirred something in him. He had always admired her intellect, but now, watching her fight on his behalf, he felt a pang of regret for everything he had thrown away. As the meeting wound down, Julia closed her notebook and stood. That's all for today. I'll have Mariana draft the preliminary motions. We'll reconvene next week. Rodrigo hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but instead, he nodded and rose to his feet. Thank you, Julia. She met his gaze, her expression guarded. Don't thank me yet. We have a long way to go. When he left, Julia sank into her chair, exhaling deeply. The tension of the encounter lingered, a constant reminder of the unresolved pain between them. Later that evening, Julia returned home to find Gabriel waiting for her in the living room, a book clutched in his small hands. Read to me, Mommy, he asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. She smiled, setting her bag down and pulling him onto her lap. As she read, his curls tickled her chin, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. He was her anchor, her reason for enduring everything life threw at her. But as she turned the pages, her mind drifted back to Rodrigo. Gabriel's questions about his father had grown more frequent lately, and now that Rodrigo was back, Julia feared those questions would only intensify. The following week, Rodrigo arrived for their second meeting, his demeanor as polished as ever. Julia had prepared a list of witnesses and evidence to examine, and she wasted no time diving into the details. As they worked, Rodrigo began to open up about the pressure he had faced in the months leading up to their wedding. It wasn't just about the company, he admitted, his voice low. It was about you. I didn't want to drag you into a life of uncertainty. Julia froze, her pen hovering over the page. You didn't want to drag me into it, so you abandoned me? Do you have any idea what that did to me, Rodrigo? I do, he said, his eyes meeting hers. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. Regret doesn't fix anything. Actions do. Their conversation turned back to the case, but the air between them was charged with unspoken emotions. Rodrigo found himself watching Julia more than he should, noticing the way her brows furrowed in concentration, or the way she tapped her pen when she was deep in thought. Julia, on the other hand, struggled to keep her focus. Every time Rodrigo spoke, she was reminded of the man she had once loved and the pain he had caused her. By the end of the meeting, both of them were exhausted. Rodrigo lingered by the door, his hand on the knob. Julia, he said softly, turning to face her, thank you for doing this. I know I don't deserve your help. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You're right, you don't. But this isn't about you. It's about me proving that I can win, no matter the odds. As he left, Julia sank into her chair, her thoughts swirling. She had built her life on strength and independence. But now, with Rodrigo back in her orbit, she felt the cracks in her armor. That night, as she tucked Gabriel into bed, he looked up at her with curious eyes. Mommy, do I have a daddy? The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She hesitated, brushing a curl from his forehead. Yes, Gabby, you do. Where is he? Julia swallowed hard, her throat tight. He's busy, but he cares about you, even if he's not here. Gabriel frowned, but he didn't press further. Julia kissed his forehead and turned off the light, retreating to the solitude of her bedroom. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. Rodrigo's return had stirred up emotions she thought she had buried. And now, with Gabriel asking questions, the fragile balance she had built was beginning to crumble. But she couldn't afford to let her personal feelings interfere. This was her case, her fight, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The rain fell in a steady rhythm outside Julia's office, streaking the glass windows as gray clouds darkened the city skyline. Inside, Julia sat with her legal team, the table between them cluttered with files, printouts, and empty coffee cups. The room buzzed with quiet activity as her associates reviewed financial records and prepared arguments. "We've subpoenaed the bank statements from Vargas," said Mariana, her assistant, flipping through a stack of documents. "If he's behind this, we should find something." Julia nodded, her mind racing. Vargas, Rodrigo's former CFO, was their strongest lead. His abrupt resignation and the coincidental timing of the whistleblower's accusations painted a suspicious picture. But suspicion wasn't enough, they needed proof. "Keep digging," Julia said, her voice steady but firm. "We need to connect Vargas directly to the leak. If we can prove that he falsified evidence or manipulated records, we can dismantle the prosecution's case." As Mariana gathered her notes, Julia's phone buzzed on the table. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat. Rodrigo. She hesitated before answering, her tone clipped. "What is it?" "There's something you need to know," Rodrigo said, his voice tense. "Can we meet in person?" "I'm in the middle of prep," Julia replied, glancing at the file spread before her. "This can't wait," he insisted. Reluctantly, she agreed. "Fine. My office in an hour." When Rodrigo arrived, he was carrying a folder in one hand, his expression grim. He didn't bother with pleasantries, setting the folder down on the table with a soft thud. "What is this?" Julia asked, opening it. "Emails," Rodrigo said, sitting across from her. "Anonymous threats I've been receiving since the whistleblower report went public. At first, I thought they were just empty words, but they've been escalating." Julia's brow furrowed as she scanned the emails. The language was sharp, laced with accusations and warnings. One stood out, bolded and written in red. "You'll pay for what you've done. Everyone you care about will." Her stomach tightened as she read the words. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" "I didn't want to alarm you," Rodrigo said, his jaw clenched. "But after the last one, I realized it wasn't just about me anymore." Julia glanced up sharply. "What do you mean?" "They mentioned you," Rodrigo said, his voice low. "And Gabriel." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, Julia's breath catching in her throat. "Gabriel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rodrigo nodded, his eyes dark with concern. "I don't know who's behind this, but they know too much. They're targeting you to get to me." Julia's hands tightened around the edges of the folder. Anger and fear surged through her, a volatile mix that made her pulse race. "You brought this into our lives," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "I know," Rodrigo said, his tone laced with regret. "And I'll do whatever it takes to protect both of you." The words hung in the air, a promise that Julia wasn't sure she believed. "Leave," she said finally, her voice cold. "I need to think." Rodrigo hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but he nodded and left. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. Every noise outside her apartment made her flinch, and the thought of Gabriel being in danger kept her mind spinning. She stayed up late, reviewing the emails and trying to piece together who might be behind them. By morning, she was exhausted but determined. She called Rodrigo. "We need to go to the police," she said without preamble. "I've already contacted a private security firm," Rodrigo replied. "They'll be at your apartment this afternoon to assess the situation." Julia bristled at his assumption of control, but bit back her retort. "Fine, but I'm handling the legal side of this. You'll follow my lead." "Agreed," Rodrigo said. The following day, Julia met with her team to discuss the new developments. Mariana had found evidence of financial irregularities tied to Vargas. Large sums of money moved into offshore accounts around the time of his resignation. "This strengthens our case," Mariana said, passing Julia the documents. "If Vargas was funneling company funds for his own gain, it undercuts the prosecution's narrative." Julia nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Good work. Let's build on this." But as they continued their preparations, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the threats were only the beginning. That evening, as she and Gabriel returned from the park, She noticed a black car parked across the street from her building. The windows were tinted, and it didn't move as she carried Gabriel inside. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the unease lingered. After Gabriel was asleep, she called Rodrigo. "There was a car outside my building tonight," she said. I don't know if it's connected, but I'll handle it," Rodrigo interrupted, his tone firm. "The security team will be there in the morning." Julia wanted to argue, but she was too tired. "Just make sure they're discreet," she said, ending the call. The next morning, 2 security specialists arrived to install cameras and alarms in Julia's apartment. Gabriel watched curiously as they worked, his questions coming in rapid-fire bursts. "What are they doing, Mommy?" "They're just making sure we're safe, Millionaire's," Julia said, ruffling his hair. "Safe from what?" Julia hesitated, her heart twisting. "It's just a precaution," she said, forcing a smile. But Gabriel's questions didn't stop. As the days passed, he grew more curious about the changes in their routine. The extra locks on the doors, the strangers watching the building. One evening, as they ate dinner, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, is it because of my daddy?" Julia froze, her fork hovering midair. "Why do you say that?" "I heard you talking on the phone," Gabriel said. "You said Rodrigo." "That's my daddy, right?" Julia felt a wave of guilt and panic crash over her. She set her fork down, reaching for Gabriel's small hand. "Yes, Gabby," she said softly. "Rodrigo is your daddy. He's helping us with something right now." Gabriel frowned, his young mind working through the information. "Why doesn't he live with us?" Julia swallowed hard. "It's complicated," she said. Gabriel nodded, but the sadness in his eyes lingered, and it broke her heart. Later that night, Julia called Rodrigo again. "Gabriel knows," she said without preamble. There was a long pause. "How much did you tell him?" Rodrigo asked. "Enough," Julia replied, her voice tight. "But he has questions. He wants to meet you." Rodrigo's breath caught. "Do you think that's a good idea?" "I don't know," Julia admitted, "but he deserves answers." The line was silent for a moment before Rodrigo spoke. "Set it up. I'll be there." As Julia ended the call, she felt a knot of anxiety twist in her chest. The shadows of their past were closing in, and she wasn't sure if they could outrun them. But one thing was certain. Gabriel's safety and happiness came first, no matter what it cost her. The cafe was quiet, tucked away in a leafy corner of the city, with soft jazz playing in the background. Julia sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from her, Gabriel swung his legs back and forth, his sneakers barely brushing the floor. He was unusually quiet, his curious eyes fixed on the door. Rodrigo was late. Julia checked her watch for the 3rd time, her frustration mounting. She had been against this meeting from the start, but Gabriel's persistent questions had left her no choice. "When is he coming?" Gabriel asked, his voice small but insistent. "Soon, Millionaire's," Julia replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Just as the thought crossed her mind, the door opened and Rodrigo stepped in. He scanned the room briefly before spotting them. His usually confident demeanor faltered for a moment when his eyes landed on Gabriel, but he quickly recovered, straightening his posture as he approached. "Hi," Rodrigo said, his voice softer than usual. Gabriel looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you my daddy?" Julia's breath caught. Gabriel's bluntness left no room for pretense. Rodrigo crouched to meet Gabriel's gaze. "Yes, I am," he said gently. "I'm your daddy." For a moment, Gabriel simply stared at him, as if trying to piece together what that meant. Then he tilted his head. "Why weren't you here before?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Julia's grip tightened on her cup, and Rodrigo hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's complicated," Rodrigo said finally, echoing Julia's own explanation. "But I'm here now, and I'd like to get to know you. Gabriel considered this for a moment before nodding solemnly. Okay. Relief washed over Rodrigo's face, and he smiled. Thank you, Gabriel. The three of them spent the next hour in the cafe, navigating a careful conversation. Gabriel was shy at first, but Rodrigo's easy charm began to draw him out. By the time they left, Gabriel was laughing at one of Rodrigo's stories about a mischievous dog he had as a child. But as they walked back to Julia's car, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. This fragile connection between Rodrigo and Gabriel felt like a ticking clock, and she wasn't sure how long it would last before something shattered it. Later that evening, after putting Gabriel to bed, Julia sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine in her hand. Her mind replayed the cafe meeting in vivid detail, lingering on the way Rodrigo had looked at Gabriel, as if seeing him was both a revelation and a reckoning. A knock at the door startled her. She set the glass down and opened the door to find Rodrigo standing there, his expression uncertain. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for letting me meet him." Julia stepped aside, allowing him in. "It wasn't for you," she said, crossing her arms. "Gabriel deserved it." Rodrigo nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Julia, but I'm trying to make things right." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Right? You think you can just walk back into our lives and fix everything?" "No," Rodrigo said quietly, "but I can try to be there for him now. I owe him that much." Julia's anger simmered, but there was no denying the sincerity in his voice. She looked away, her throat tight. "You miss so much," she said after a moment. "His first steps, his first words. You weren't there when he had a fever, and I spent the whole night holding him, praying it wasn't something worse. You don't get to just step in now and play the hero." Rodrigo's expression twisted with guilt. "I know I can't make up for what I missed, but I want to try." Julia shook her head, her emotions warring within her. I don't know if I can trust you, Rodrigo. Not with him." He took a step closer, his voice steady. "Then don't trust me. Trust him. Gabriel deserves a chance to decide if he wants me in his life." The word struck a chord, and Julia's resolve wavered. She nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but this isn't about you. It's about Gabriel." Rodrigo nodded, accepting the terms. In the days that followed, Rodrigo began spending more time with Gabriel. He took him to the park, helped him with puzzles, and even endured an afternoon of finger painting that left him covered in smudges of bright colors. Gabriel's laughter rang through the apartment, and for the first time in a long while, Julia saw him truly happy. But the growing bond between them only deepened her internal conflict. As much as she wanted Gabriel to have a father, the scars Rodrigo had left on her heart still throbbed. One evening, as Julia cleaned up the remnants of dinner, Rodrigo lingered in the kitchen. "You've done an incredible job with him," he said, his voice quiet. Julia glanced at him, surprised. "I didn't have a choice," she replied. "I know," Rodrigo said, his gaze earnest. "But that doesn't make it any less remarkable." The compliment caught her off guard, and she turned away, focusing on the dishes. "What do you want, Rodrigo?" "I want to be part of his life," he said. "And maybe I want to find a way to make amends with you, too." Julia froze, her hands stilling in the soapy water. "It's not that simple." "I know," he said, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "We'll see," she said, her voice low. That night, as she lay in bed, the memories of their past resurfaced. The love they had shared, the plans they had made, and the pain of his betrayal all played out like a haunting film reel in her mind. Rodrigo's return had brought back everything she had worked so hard to bury. And though part of her wanted to believe he had changed, the other part feared he would hurt her and Gabriel all over again. For now, she decided, she would keep her guard up. Gabriel's happiness was her priority, and she wouldn't let anything jeopardize it. Not even the man she had once loved. The morning air was crisp, But Julia barely noticed as she rushed Gabriel out the door and toward the car. She had a full schedule ahead: depositions, meetings, and a court filing that couldn't be delayed. Gabriel chattered happily beside her, clutching his favorite toy car, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. As they reached the car, a sleek black sedan parked across the street caught her eye. It was the same car she had noticed before, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to act normal, buckling Gabriel into his car seat with a reassuring smile. "Ready to go, meu amor?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. "Ready," Gabriel chirped. On the drive to the daycare, Julia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She checked the rear-view mirror repeatedly, half expecting the black sedan to follow them, but the road behind her remained empty. By the time she reached her office, her nerves were frayed. Mariana greeted her at the door with a stack of files. "Morning, Julia. Everything okay?" "Fine," Julia replied, though her tight smile said otherwise. She set her bag down and scanned her calendar, already mentally prioritizing her tasks for the day. But as she reached for the first file, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer. "Hello." A man's voice came through, low and deliberate. "Ms. Vasconcelos, I suggest you drop the Montero case. It's not worth the trouble." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice continued. "What's important is that you step away before things get messy." The line went dead. Julia stared at her phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Everything okay?" Mariana asked, noticing her pale face. Julia forced a nod. "Just a prank call. Let's get started." But the tension lingered. Throughout the day, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, her mind replaying the warning. That evening, after picking Gabriel up from daycare, Julia called Rodrigo. "We need to talk," she said, her voice clipped. Rodrigo arrived at her apartment within the hour. Julia waited until Gabriel was asleep before confronting him in the living room. "I got a call today," she said without preamble. "Someone told me to drop your case." Rodrigo's jaw tightened. "What did they say?" "Exactly. They said it wasn't worth the trouble, and they made it clear they know who I am." Rodrigo paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "This is getting out of hand. First the emails, now this. I need to figure out who's behind it." Julia crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling over. "You should have figured that out before dragging me and Gabriel into this." Rodrigo stopped, his expression pained. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Julia. I'd never put Gabriel in danger." "Whether you meant to or not doesn't change the fact that it's happening," she shot back. "We need a plan. This isn't just about you anymore." Rodrigo nodded, his gaze steady. "I'll double the security detail, and I'll dig deeper into Vargas. If he's behind this, he won't get away with it." Julia sighed, some of her anger dissipating. "I'm not backing down from this case, Rodrigo. But if anything happens to Gabriel, anything, I'll never forgive you." The weight of her words hung between them, and Rodrigo nodded solemnly. "I won't let that happen." The next few days were a whirlwind of heightened security and relentless work. Julia's team uncovered more evidence implicating Vargas, including suspicious communications with the whistleblower. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the pressure was mounting. One night, after Gabriel had gone to bed, Julia stayed up late reviewing documents. A knock at the door startled her, and she reached for her phone before cautiously approaching. "Who is it?" she called, her voice firm. "It's me," Rodrigo replied. She opened the door to find him standing there, his face shadowed by exhaustion. "I have something," he said, holding up a folder. Inside were copies of emails exchanged between Vargas and a known competitor, detailing plans to sabotage Rodrigo's company. "This is it," Rodrigo said, his voice laced with relief. "This proves Vargas had a motive and was working with outside forces." Julia studied the documents, her mind racing. We'll need to authenticate these, but if they hold up, this could turn the case around. Rodrigo nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you, Julia, for everything. She looked away, the weight of their shared history pressing down on her. Don't thank me yet. We still have a fight ahead. As Rodrigo turned to leave, he hesitated. Julia, about Gabriel. What about him? I want to spend more time with him, Rodrigo said, his voice careful. I want to be part of his life. Julia's chest tightened. This isn't about what you want, Rodrigo. It's about what's best for him. And I think having his father in his life is what's best, Rodrigo replied, his tone firm but not unkind. Julia studied him for a long moment before nodding. We'll see. The following weekend, Rodrigo took Gabriel to a nearby park. Julia watched from a bench as the two of them played, Gabriel's laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope. But as the day wore on, her phone buzzed with another anonymous message. You've been warned. Stop now, or you'll regret it. Julia's hands shook as she stared at the screen. The threats were escalating, and she knew they couldn't be ignored any longer. That evening, she called Rodrigo and showed him the message. This isn't just about you anymore, she said, her voice trembling with anger. It's about us. Gabriel, they're targeting everything I care about. Rodrigo's expression hardened. Then we fight back. Together. Julia looked at him, her emotions warring within her. Trusting Rodrigo again felt like stepping onto a fragile bridge, but she had no choice. For Gabriel's sake, she had to keep going, even if it meant risking everything. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Julia was ready for war. She adjusted her blazer in the mirror of the small antechamber adjacent to the court and took a deep breath. Outside, reporters clamored for sound bites, the chaos of their questions muffled by the thick wooden doors. This trial was more than just another high-profile case. It was the moment everything would come to a head. Rodrigo stood nearby, his face a mask of composure, though his tightly clenched hands betrayed his anxiety. He glanced at Julia, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. Everything's going to be fine, she said, her tone firm but quiet. Stick to the plan. No surprises. Rodrigo nodded, but Julia could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Neither was she. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The murmur of the spectators, the shuffle of papers, even the clicking of pens ceased as the bailiff called the session to order. Julia stood as the trial began, every movement deliberate, her presence commanding. The prosecution opened with a scathing argument, painting Rodrigo as a greedy CEO who had manipulated his company's finances to line his own pockets. They presented their evidence. Doctor spreadsheets, email trails, and a whistleblower testimony that painted a damning picture. Julia remained impassive, but inside, she bristled. She knew how to dismantle their narrative, piece by piece. When it was her turn to cross-examine the whistleblower, she approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. You testified that Mr. Montero gave direct orders to alter the company's financial records, she began, her voice calm but firm. The whistleblower, a nervous man in his 40s, nodded. Yes, that's correct. Julia tilted her head slightly. And these orders were given when exactly? The man hesitated, shuffling through his notes. In December of last year. Julia nodded. December of last year. Interesting. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that Mr. Montero was out of the country for the entirety of December last year, attending conferences and meeting with international partners. I have flight records and signed contracts to support this. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The whistleblower's face reddened as he stammered. Well, maybe I got the dates wrong. Maybe? Julia's voice sharpened. Or maybe you're lying under oath, fabricating events to support a false narrative. The judge banged his gavel. Ms. Vasconcelos, keep it professional. Julia nodded curtly. Of course, Your Honor. She turned back to the witness. No further questions. She returned to her seat, her mind racing. The whistleblower's credibility was cracked, but she knew the prosecution still had more ammunition. The day dragged on, each piece of evidence a test of Julia's skill and resolve. She picked apart the prosecution's arguments, using the documents Rodrigo had provided. Emails exposing Vargas's dealings with a competitor. Financial records showing discrepancies long before Rodrigo's tenure, and testimonies from other executives who corroborated Rodrigo's innocence. The turning point came when Julia called Vargas himself to the stand. Vargas entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. He smirked as he took the oath, his demeanor relaxed. "Mr. Vargas," Julia began, her tone almost conversational. "You served as CFO for Montero Tech for 5 years, correct?" "That's correct," Vargas replied. "And you resigned shortly before the whistleblower came forward?" "Yes," Vargas said, his smirk faltering slightly. Julia paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to make him uncomfortable. "Why did you resign, Mr. Vargas?" "I decided to pursue other opportunities," he said, his voice casual. "How convenient," Julia said, her tone dry. She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a document. "Let's talk about these wire transfers to an offshore account under your name. Care to explain?" The color drained from Vargas's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Julia held up another document. "Perhaps you'd like to explain these emails between you and one of Montero Tech's competitors, outlining plans to sabotage the company's financial stability in exchange for a cushy position after the fallout." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the judge banging his gavel for order. Vargas squirmed in his seat, his confident facade crumbling. I don't recall those emails," he stammered. Julia arched an eyebrow. "That's convenient. Fortunately, we have digital forensic experts who authenticated them." She stepped closer to the witness stand, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You orchestrated this entire scheme to frame Rodrigo Montero, didn't you?" "I did no such thing," Vargas snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "No further questions, Your Honor," Julia said, returning to her seat. By the time closing arguments began, the momentum had shifted. Julia delivered a powerful speech, weaving together the evidence and casting doubt on the prosecution's case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "this case isn't about justice. It's about greed and betrayal. The real culprit, Mr. Vargas, tried to hide his crimes by pointing the finger at my client. But the evidence speaks for itself. Rodrigo Montero is not guilty." The jury deliberated for hours, and each minute felt like an eternity. Rodrigo sat beside Julia, his hands clenched together, his face pale. "Do you think we'll win?" he asked quietly. Julia hesitated. She wanted to reassure him, but the truth was, juries were unpredictable. "We've done everything we could," she said instead. When the jury finally returned, the entire courtroom held its breath. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Rodrigo Montero, not guilty." A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by gasps and murmurs. Rodrigo turned to Julia, his eyes wide with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Julia nodded, her expression calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. As they left the courthouse, the press swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Rodrigo paused, turning to Julia. "Go home to Gabriel," he said softly. "I'll handle this." She hesitated, then nodded, grateful for the reprieve. That night, as she tucked Gabriel into bed, Julia felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The battle was over and they had won, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. One where Rodrigo would have to prove, day by day, that he deserved the second chance life had given him. And for the first time in years, Julia allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Together, the verdict had come down like a thunderclap, bringing relief and vindication. Yet, for Rodrigo, walking out of that courthouse didn't feel like victory. The damage to his company, his name, and most of all, his relationships couldn't be undone with two simple words: not guilty. In the days following the trial, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Every news outlet wanted his side of the story. Analysts debated whether his reputation could recover. Investors hesitated, and board members called for damage control. But Rodrigo found himself more concerned about a far smaller audience: Julia and Gabriel. It was Gabriel who greeted him first when he arrived at Julia's apartment that Saturday afternoon. The boy opened the door with a wide grin, his excitement unmistakable. "Daddy," Gabriel exclaimed, his small arms wrapping around Rodrigo's legs. Rodrigo crouched to Gabriel's level, his chest tightening as he returned the hug. It was still strange to hear that word, "Daddy," directed at him. It carried a weight he wasn't sure he could bear, but desperately wanted to. "Hey, buddy," Rodrigo said, ruffling Gabriel's curls. "How's my favorite guy?" "I made you a picture," Gabriel announced, grabbing his hand and pulling him inside. Julia appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "You're early," she said, her tone neutral. "I wanted to spend as much time with him as I could," Rodrigo replied, meeting her gaze. She nodded, stepping aside as Gabriel tugged Rodrigo toward the kitchen table. Spread across it was a jumble of crayons, construction paper, and glitter glue. Gabriel held up a drawing: a bright yellow sun, a stick-figure family, and a house with a crooked roof. "This is us," Gabriel declared proudly. Rodrigo's throat tightened as he looked at the drawing. He hadn't expected to be included in Gabriel's vision of family so soon. "It's perfect," he said, smiling. Julia watched the interaction from a distance, her arms still crossed. She couldn't deny that Rodrigo was trying, but years of betrayal and absence weren't erased so easily. "I'm taking him to the park," Rodrigo said after a while. "If that's okay." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Just don't let him out of your sight." Rodrigo glanced at her, his expression earnest. "I won't." The park was bustling with families, enjoying the mild afternoon. Rodrigo pushed Gabriel on the swings, his laughter echoing through the air, and helped him navigate the monkey bars. Other parents glanced at him occasionally, recognizing him from the news, but he ignored them. For once, his focus was entirely on his son. "Daddy, look at me," Gabriel shouted, perched at the top of the slide. "I see you," Rodrigo called back, smiling. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they sat on a bench sharing an ice cream cone. Gabriel's face was smeared with chocolate, and Rodrigo couldn't stop smiling. It was such a simple moment, yet it felt monumental. Later, back at the apartment, Julia opened the door to find Rodrigo carrying a sleeping Gabriel in his arms. The sight caught her off guard. Rodrigo's usually polished demeanor softened by the tenderness in his expression. "He fell asleep in the car," Rodrigo said quietly. Julia stepped aside, watching as Rodrigo carried Gabriel to his room and gently laid him down. He lingered for a moment, brushing a curl from the boy's forehead before turning to leave. When he returned to the living room, Julia handed him a glass of water. "He had fun," she said, her tone softer than before. Rodrigo nodded, taking a sip. "I did too." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "Thank you for letting me spend time with him," Rodrigo said finally. "I know I don't deserve it." Julia sighed, setting her glass down. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what Gabriel deserves. And he deserves a father who shows up, who stays." Rodrigo nodded, her words hitting him with the weight of truth. "I'm trying, Julia. I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Julia looked at him, her expression conflicted. She wanted to believe him, but the scars he'd left ran deep. "Time will tell," she said quietly. In the weeks that followed, Rodrigo began to rebuild his life. He spent more time with Gabriel, taking him to soccer games, helping with homework, and reading bedtime stories. Each moment felt like a step toward redemption, though he knew the road was long. At the same time, he worked to restore his company's reputation. He held press conferences, addressed shareholders, and implemented stricter policies to prevent future scandals. It wasn't easy. There were still skeptics and detractors, but Rodrigo was determined to prove he was worthy of a second chance. One evening, after Gabriel had fallen asleep, Rodrigo and Julia sat on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I meant what I said," Rodrigo began, breaking the silence. "I'm not going anywhere. Not for him. Not for you." Julia's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Rodrigo, this isn't just about showing up for a few weeks or months. It's about being consistent, being reliable. Gabriel doesn't need promises. He needs actions." Rodrigo nodded. "I know, and I'm ready to do the work." She turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of pretense. What she saw instead was a man who had been humbled, who was willing to fight for what mattered. "I've changed, Julia," Rodrigo said, his voice earnest. "Not because I want to fix my image or my company, but because I want to be the kind of man Gabriel can look up to, and the kind of man you can trust again." Julia's chest tightened at his words. Part of her wanted to push him away, to protect herself from the pain of another betrayal. But another part, a quieter, more vulnerable part, wanted to believe him. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Rodrigo reached for her hand but stopped short, respecting her space. "Take your time," he said softly. "I'll be here." For the first time in years, Julia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something new. Not the fairy tale they had once imagined, but something real, something stronger. As the night deepened, they sat together in silence, the distant hum of the city their only companion. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. The sun rose quietly over Sao Paulo, painting the city in shades of gold and soft lavender. Julia stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The sounds of the city waking up drifted through the air, cars honking in the distance, a vendor calling out his wares on the street below, and faint laughter from a passing group. Behind her, Gabriel's giggles broke the morning stillness. She turned to see him sitting on the floor, surrounded by an array of toy cars. Rodrigo was sprawled beside him, pretending to be the announcer of a high-stakes race. "And the red car takes the lead." Rodrigo's deep voice boomed dramatically. "But wait, what's this?" "The blue car is closing in." Gabriel clapped his hands in delight, his laughter filling the room. Julia watched them for a moment, her heart caught in a strange, bittersweet ache. This was a life she had dreamed of years ago. Her son, her partner, a family. But reality was more complicated, and the wounds of the past didn't heal overnight. "Breakfast is ready," she said, interrupting the race. Rodrigo looked up, his smile softening as their eyes met. He helped Gabriel to his feet, ruffling the boy's curls before following him to the table. As they ate, Julia found herself marveling at how naturally Rodrigo had slipped into their lives. He showed up every day now, whether it was to pick Gabriel up from school, join them for dinner, or help with bedtime stories. He wasn't perfect, but he was present, and that made all the difference. Later that afternoon, Rodrigo and Julia sat across from each other in the living room, the air between them filled with an unspoken tension. "I've been thinking," Rodrigo began, breaking the silence, "about the future, about us." Julia set her book down, her gaze steady. "And what have you decided?" Rodrigo hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust completely, and I don't expect things to go back to how they were. But I want us to build something new, something better." Julia's heart clenched. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let go of the fear and doubt that had kept her guarded for so long. But the other part, the one that remembered the pain of being left behind, held her back. "I need to know you're in this for the right reasons, Rodrigo," she said quietly. "Not just for Gabriel, but for us, for me." He nodded, his expression earnest. "I am, but I also know I can't erase the past. All I can do is show you, day by day, that I've changed, that I'm here for you both." The vulnerability in his voice broke through some of her defenses. She nodded slowly. "Okay, but we take it one step at a time. No rushing, no promises we can't keep." Rodrigo smiled, relief washing over his face. One step at a time. In the weeks that followed, their lives began to settle into a new rhythm. Rodrigo moved into an apartment a few blocks away, close enough to be involved but far enough to give Julia the space she needed. He continued to rebuild his company's reputation, dedicating himself to transparency and ethical practices. Meanwhile, Julia focused on her law firm, taking on new clients and mentoring young lawyers who reminded her of herself. Gabriel thrived with both parents in his life, his confidence and curiosity growing with each passing day. One Saturday, the three of them ventured to a nearby beach, escaping the city for a day of sun and sand. Gabriel ran ahead, his small feet kicking up sand as he chased the waves. Rodrigo and Julia walked behind him, their pace leisurely. "You seem happier," Rodrigo said, glancing at her. Julia smiled faintly. "I think I am." They reached a spot where Gabriel had stopped to collect seashells, his face alight with wonder. Julia crouched beside him, helping him examine each one. "Look, Mommy, this one's shiny," Gabriel exclaimed, holding up a pearly shell. "It's beautiful," Julia said, her voice warm. As she looked up, she caught Rodrigo watching them, his expression soft and full of something she couldn't quite name. That evening, after Gabriel was asleep, Rodrigo lingered on the balcony of Julia's apartment. She joined him, the cool night air brushing against her skin. "Thank you," Rodrigo said, his voice quiet. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance," he replied, turning to face her. "I know it hasn't been easy." Julia looked out at the city lights, her thoughts swirling. "It hasn't, but I think we're finally in a place where we can start again." Rodrigo reached for her hand, his touch tentative. She let him, their fingers intertwining. "Starting again doesn't mean forgetting," she said. "It means learning from what went wrong and doing better. For Gabriel, for us." Rodrigo nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I won't let you down." In that moment, Julia felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Over time, their relationship grew stronger, built on honesty and mutual respect. They didn't try to recreate what they had lost, but instead focused on building something new. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but they faced them together, one day at a time. Gabriel thrived in their care, his laughter filling their days with joy. He became the bridge that connected them, reminding them of what truly mattered. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they walked it hand in hand, knowing that the past didn't define them. What mattered was the future they were creating, a future rooted in love, forgiveness, and the quiet, unwavering belief that second chances could lead to something beautiful. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.